Hey guys, welcome back to Fast Films. I'm John and today we are going through a 2015 American horror film called Excess Flesh. The film starts off as we see a young girl named Jennifer dancing around while talking to her roommate Jill. Jennifer speaks about the branded clothes her fashion designer Nina gave to her. She then sits with Jill and asks her to come out for the night. Jill refuses, so Jennifer begins to talk about Rob, who's apparently Jill's crush. Therefore, she makes Jennifer promise that she won't approach Rob. Afterwards, Jill convinces her roommate to stay in for the night. They both drop on the bed and start laughing while eating Doritos. Jennifer plays along for some time but soon gets fed up with the boring environment and decides to go out. The following day, Jill wakes up and finds Jennifer sprawled on the bed after an eventful night. She then checks her weight, which goes beyond 120 pounds. After heaving a sigh, she walks to the living room where a guy, by the name of Steven, is watching the TV while eating a Pop-Tart. As Jill approaches him, he begins to laugh uncontrollably. When Steven catches Jill looking at him, he gets up and leaves. Up next, we witness that a house party is going on. The girls are arguing and discussing what Jill eats. Meanwhile, we see Jill struggling to eat some food in her room. She crushes a Pop-Tart and throws it into the bin but later begins to hungrily devour everything. The overeating makes her run to the bathroom where she gets stopped by Rob. There, they spark a conversation in which both of them talk briefly to each other. Jill becomes clearly impressed by Rob as she becomes shy and timid. Unfortunately, she begins to feel sick, so she rushes into the bathroom. Rob waits outside for some time, but as Jill's situation continues to decline, he leaves. As the next morning arrives, Jill walks into the living room and finds Jennifer sleeping with Rob. Utterly furious, she picks up Jennifer and cleans her belly with Rob's t-shirt. Rob apologizes for a while but Jill admonishes him, eventually forcing him to leave. Later on, Jennifer wakes up and comes to the door where their neighbor Kathy is standing. She talks about the apartment's party policy, but Jennifer simply ignores her and keeps the door closed. Afterward, she prepares a meal and hungrily eats it while watching TV. In the interim, Jill approaches her and tries to ask for help in her own personal development, but Jennifer simply scolds her and demeans her. She turns on her bitchy side and begins to humiliate Jill for her uselessness and fatness. The same night, Jennifer's moans ring through the house as she spends the night with Steven. Jill closes her ears as she can't sleep due to the noise. Alas, she gets up and prepares noodles for herself. She then sits in front of the television and tries to eat, but eventually throws the spoonfuls into the bucket. After a while, she forcibly begins to eat the noodles and slaps herself after every bite. Her psychotic nature begins to divulge as she keeps on slapping herself. The following morning, she lays passed out on the sofa with a heap of garbage around her. Steven passes her and walks out of the apartment. In the meantime, Jill sobers up and turns on Facebook. There, she finds a picture of Rob with some children. Just then, her mother calls her and begins to talk to her. Her mother, who's apparently drunk, says that someone is home, but it turns out to be Jill's father, who picks her drunk mother and cuts the call. In the meantime, the doorbell rings and Rob is outside. Jill dresses up and invites him in. She cooks him a delicious meal and they both sit together at the table. She asks him about the children and Rob states that they're not his. He works at the Children Facilitation Center and those children are from there. After they finish up the meal, Rob gets up to leave. Just at the door, they both share a romantic moment which turns into a kiss. Jill becomes really timid after that and says goodbye to him. Later that night, Jennifer returns home from work and Jill confronts her about touching Rob. Jennifer waves it away as if it's nothing. Upon that, Jill becomes impatient and mentions that they both need to talk about things. Jennifer pushes that away as well, saying that they will talk tomorrow. The next day, Jill prepares a lavish lunch with roasted duck and vegetables. Moreover, she opens up a present from Kathy with a letter mentioning that if she ever wants to talk, Kathy will always be there for her. Within the package, Jill finds a button which says, "Cinch." She then puts it away and waits for Jennifer at lunch. After the passing of the whole day, Jennifer returns home in the dark and finds Jill waiting for her. She becomes surprised upon finding the duck on the table, but upon tasting it, degrades it as well. Jill then mentions again that she wants to talk, but Jennifer pays no heed to it. That makes Jill lose her temper and she attacks Jennifer. Unfortunately for her, Jennifer becomes offensive and hits her before pinning her to the ground. She threatens Jill and then goes to sleep in her bedroom. That event surfaces Jill's evil side. She uses chloroform to pass out Jennifer. And when she opens her eyes, she finds herself tied by shackles. Jill sits in front of her and states that they need to talk. Jennifer is shocked to the core as she helplessly slides to the floor. Jill then starts laughing menacingly as Jennifer struggles with the chains. After some time, Jill comes back to the room with a cake. She cuts it in front of Jennifer, making her crave for it. She then takes a hefty bite and begins to taunt Jennifer about her marriage with Trevor. Jennifer becomes traumatized upon having those thoughts. Nevertheless, Jill pushes her into remembering her time with Trevor. Jennifer becomes deeply grieved as she states that Trevor was cruel and forced her to do worse things. The thoughts eventually make her cry, while Jill sits in front of her, totally unfazed. Jennifer pleads with her to let her go, but Jill doesn't pay any attention to her and simply leaves. Time passes on and Jill returns to her room once again, only to find Jennifer shrieking and jumping uncontrollably. As she screams in agony, Jill stands unbothered. When Jennifer settles down, Jill walks to her side and starts marking different areas of her body, while mentioning that everyone can hear her but nobody will come to her help. Up next, we see Jill sleeping on the couch when the doorbell rings and Rob comes outside. Jill snaps on her numb leg and hurriedly rushes to the door, where she sees Rob having contact with Kathy. Jill becomes jealous and walks into Jennifer's room to find her smiling. Anger rises in Jill's mind as she sees Jennifer fully composed. Out of sheer frustration, she begins to threaten Jennifer and slaps her continuously. Afterward, she brings boxes of gummy bears and forces Jennifer to eat them like a dog. Jill loses herself due to the frustration and calls Jennifer selfish while throwing all the jellies on her. Later on, she gets a call from her mother. The old drunk woman tells her that she's going into rehab. Upon that, Jill starts crying and closes the laptop. Afterward, she orders some chemicals online and inflicts utter brutality on Jennifer. She then forces her to dance. Jennifer tries her best to stay on her feet. In the meantime, Rob comes to visit her and offers his help, but Jill sends him away. As he leaves, she picks up the packages outside and brings them in to mix some chemicals. She prepares injections with that chemical and laughs evilly. Later that night, she watches TV and slowly slides her hand into her undergarments and elevates into a dream where she gets close to Rob. Their intimacy takes high levels and suddenly, a competition begins between Jill and Jennifer. The judges sit at the table and try to analyze the best love partner. Jill keeps on going with Rob while Jennifer gets pounded by Steven. She then opens the mystery box once again until Trevor comes out and starts beating Jennifer. The lovemaking turns into cruelty as Trevor unleashes his sadistic self. He begins to bounce on Jennifer, while the judges immediately leave the table. Jill also ends her pleasure trip with Rob and lies down in a motionless state. With a jolt, she wakes up from her dream and walks towards Jennifer's room. To her utter surprise, she finds out that Jennifer has escaped. In order to locate her, Jill runs out of the house and dashes across the streets, looking for Jennifer. Ultimately, she finds her sitting on the pavement in a hypnotized state. Just as Jill approaches her, two cops also pull up and begin to inquire with them. The cops ask the reason for being out in the undressed state and Jill mentions that her roommate is having a disturbed sleep cycle. Moreover, she pleads with the male officer to let them go. As he's reconsidering, his associate mentions that they can't just let the two girls go, upon which Jill gets up and talks to the lady officer. As soon as she mentions that there's been a guy, the female also allows her to go back to the apartment. Therefore, Jill takes Jennifer and they both return to the apartment. Once inside, Jill takes Jennifer to the shower and puts her in the bathtub where she sits in a complete trauma. In her distorted mental state, she begins to cry and state how evil Trevor was. Furthermore, she begins to whine about how hard it is for her and how hard she's trying. Jill consoles her for a while and hugs her. After a while, Jennifer begins to motivate Jill. She compliments her cooking and states that she should share it with the world and Jennifer will help her. That makes Jill happy for a while, but it soon turns out that Jennifer was only making that stuff up. She suddenly starts screaming for help again, due to which Jill tries to drown her in the bathtub. Jennifer fights back for a moment, but Jill uses the shower pipe to strangle her. In her utter bestiality, she wraps the pipe around Jennifer's neck and injects the prepared chemical into her arm, until she passes out. Later on, we see that Kathy is outside the apartment with some cake. Jill drags the unconscious Jennifer across the hall, into the bedroom. She then turns on Facebook to see Rob's comment on Kathy's pictures. Anger fuels in her and she texts Rob to stay away from her, from now on. Just then, she receives a message from Kathy asking her to come outside. As Jill opens the door, Kathy apologizes for being so pushy and presents the cake as an apology. Instead of accepting it, Jill smashes the cake and closes the door on Kathy. Up next, we see both the roommates sitting together and laughing about various things. Jill receives a call from Rob, but she leaves it on voicemail on Jennifer's command. Both of them then hear Rob break up with Jill and say that he can't do it anymore. Jill pays no attention and keeps on laughing, but then Jennifer mentions that, "We don't need him." Upon that, Jill catches the word, "we," and becomes extremely angry as she realizes it was Jennifer all along who was hitting on Rob. She becomes furious with her and as a punishment, halts all the food supply for Jennifer. The facts make Jill go wild. She begins to cut off her own clothes and runs around like a crazy person. She begins eating food voraciously while ruining half of it. She then takes a knife and slowly approaches Jennifer's bedroom. In her madness, Jill strangles Jennifer and pins her to the ground. Afterward, she thrusts the knife in her belly and keeps on pushing it until Jennifer bleeds out completely. They both then kiss each other and the scene fades out. The following morning, the camera shifts to the modeling agency where Nina is taking auditions of the girls. She judges everyone on their bodies when suddenly, her associate tells her that Jennifer is here. Nina goes to her office and looks at the photo album where Jill's photos are side by side with Jennifer's. Nina rejects Jill's proposals while mentioning that flakiness is not fashionable. She then gets up and approaches Jennifer, who injects Nina with the chemical and watches her reflection in the mirror. Back in reality, we see that it was actually Jill, imagining herself as Jennifer. The camera then pans to the filthy apartment where Jill prepares yet another meal. Horrifyingly enough, the meal is composed of the excess flesh around Jill's belly. We see her standing there and eating the meat, which eventually puts an end to the film. Thanks for watching, guys.